It's always muddy.
Right, good evening. Hello, what a lovely full house. Welcome to Kendal Mountain Festival. I'm Beth and I get very, very overexcited at the festival. That's just the way it is. Every year my husband says that I'll peak too soon and I haven't yet. So I'm basically running on crisps and Haribo right now.
You have totally just jinxed yourself now, though.
Never.
Never say.
Never. Never happened. Right, let me do the official welcome bit. Gotta get this right. So welcome to Kendal Book Festival, presented as part of Kendal Mountain Festival. And we're delighted to have Cotswold Outdoor as our official partner, and they're all on my little card. So if I hold them up, then you can see it regularly. There is going to be a signing after the event at the back, and you'll also be able to purchase books at our wonderful bookshop, which is outside the Brewery Arts Centre. But there are some books there. They are being beautifully modelled. We should have one on the stage. Oh, we've got one on the stage.
Yeah. This is slightly not only very battered because it's been around with me a bit, but also slightly different to the ones at the back because this is a first edition. Ooh. These are second editions, which are slightly shinier and brighter. So there you go.
Health and safety stuff, please can you switch off all phones or set them onto silent or vibrate? If you could check that now, that would be great. If there are any issues that happen during the course of the event, there really shouldn't be, but we've got a great crack team of volunteers that are on site that'll be able to help us evacuate the building or take care of any other emergencies. And I think that's it for the health and safety. So what's going to happen is we're going to have a lovely chat. I'll introduce Polly in a moment. And we'll have a queue. I'll be interviewing Polly for 45 minutes or so. We have got a clock here. I believe it's Paul Scully says it is rigged to some sort of ejector seat because we can talk quite a lot.
Beth and I have both been known to talk.
So this could go on a while. So, buckle up. But we will switch to audience questions at the end. So if you do have questions, we will have the last 15 minutes or so of audience questions. So I'm Beth, and let me introduce this lovely lady on my left. This is Polly Atkin. This should be such a long thing. This is, seriously, can I just tell you, this is the edited highlights. A poet and non-fiction writer. She's published 3 poetry pamphlets and 2 collections, amongst many other things. Her non-fiction work includes, I love this, Recovering Dorothy. This could be a whole separate talk here that I could go off to. The Hidden Life of Dorothy Wordsworth, which was long-listed for the Barbellion Award, about Dorothy's later life and illness. She contributed an essay on rain and chronic illness in the groundbreaking anthology Moving Mountains, Writing Nature Through Illness and Disability. And Some of Us Just Fall. I got the title right.
Well done. Because earlier on, Beth completely lost the title.
I totally lost the title.
Great.
We did another interview and I completely forgot the title of the book. And it's on nature and not getting better, a memoir exploring place, belonging, and disability. So welcome, Polly.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
And thank you so much, everyone, for being here this evening, for being here this evening, and to being here this evening.
I'll let you, you're probably better at the grammar than I am.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? I should say at this point that I had half an hour's sleep last night because I had a really terrible insomnia. So I have no idea who I am now. So I could be giving the answers of anybody when we get to this book. I might be giving the answers of one of the deer. Who knows?
We could go with that. But you said you don't know who you are. Do you want me to go over the intro again?
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Who is this Polly Atkin? And what has she written? I don't know.
Well, actually, that's a good first question to start with. So the book is called Some of Us Just Fall. Can you give us a quick overview of what it's about, Polly? In your own words.
So it's a mix of nature writing and memoir, and I started writing it after I was diagnosed when I was 34 and 35 with 2 genetic conditions which had been making me ill my entire life, but which I didn't know existed at that point. So I'd been told up until then that I was making my symptoms up, blah, 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 all that nonsense. And meanwhile, I've been living in the Lake District, where all of the writing about place is about things that we've been hearing about this weekend. So it's about the outdoors, it's about climbing mountains, it's about being on top of mountains, and things that had become completely inaccessible to me at the very worst of my illness before diagnosis. And I was trying to work out a way to place myself back into that landscape and to think about how we can write about those things differently.
And it's an amazing book, and we're going to try and cover as many bits of it as we can during this session. But I think one of the predominant things that weaves its way through the book is your path to diagnosis. And it was fair to say it's not smooth, and I'm tempted to say, could you give us an overview of that? But that's pretty much the whole book.
Yeah, it would take a long time.
It would take a long time. But can you give us just some of the key moments on that path to diagnosis, and how long it took from the time you first had symptoms to when it was actually, I would say your conditions were diagnosed?
So it's a bit of a how long is a piece of string answer in some ways, because as I say, in some ways, these conditions have been making me ill my entire life. So one of them is a hereditary connective tissue disorder, which once I was diagnosed, it became very clear that my entire life had been dictated by it from the moment I was born, or really before I was born onwards. The fact that I was born prematurely was also part of that. But from my first steps, when I walked with my feet turning inwards like that, onwards, that was my life. But at all times we were told, no, it was just pretty normal, just carry on. And I became very ill when I was a teenager, at which point, because I was a clever girl, I was told that I was inventing my illness, because that's what clever girls do, apparently. And that had I think, a very dramatic effect on my sense of self and my sense of who I was in the world as well, that sense of not being believed, which really had actually been there a long time before that too, but became pressing, I think, at that point. So then I kind of tried to pretend to be normal for a few years because I've been told I was, which anyone who's done that for whatever reason will know you can only pretend to be normal for a short period of time. So I became very ill again in my early 20s, and at that point I was diagnosed with fibromyalgia, which didn't quite fit for me, but I kind of ran with it, thought that it might help, and again I had a few years where I managed a bit, and then I got iller again. And then that eventually led kind of 4 years after I first got really ill again, when I was 29, 30, to my diagnoses. Wow,
that is quite the journey. And
yeah.
And that journey to diagnoses in the book made a lot of people swear at the book in a good way. I don't know if people have read the book yet, but certainly I was amongst those people. That's one of the things I said to you. I said, look, your book made me swear, but in a good way. Can you explain a bit more about that? Because that's not the first time you've heard that.
Yeah, so quite a lot of people have said that they've had that reaction. There's been a lot of crying, a lot of swearing. There's also been breaking of crockery. I was discussing this earlier as a kind of reader effect, a kind of haunting that happens with the book. So one of the byproducts of my connective tissue disorder is that I have really poor proprioception, which is the sense of the self as a body in space. Which is compounded by the kind of loose ligaments and also low bone density. So I fall over a lot, and when I fall over, I break myself or I break other things. And people have read the book and then found that they've been dropping things and walking into doors and throwing things over as well. So what we decided earlier is that it's actually quite dangerous, and I apologize. The publisher, I think, says that they cannot be held responsible for anything that happens to you as a reader because of this book. I sympathize and empathize if it makes you cry or swear. I will not be held responsible for your broken teacups.
Oh, that's totally fair. Totally fair. And on this route to diagnoses, doctors did make a lot of assumptions about you. And I think because that, to me, is very closely connected to when I was swearing at the book. So doctors made lots of assumptions. I mean, for you, which were the most frustrating assumptions that were made?
Oh, gosh, just so many. It's hard to know where to start, really. I mean, there's more that actually aren't even in the book. Wow. As well. There's a lot which are there. Very strange ones, if you've been through a process of diagnosis, especially with a chronic illness, these will be familiar, but you're either too fat or too thin. There is no ideal weight. Your illnesses are either caused by you being too fat or too thin. You're also always the wrong age. So you're either too old or you're too young. And there's an invisible moment in which you flip over from one of those to the other, but no one can tell you when. And that's quite baffling. So the kind of arbitrariness of some of those things I found particularly frustrating. And one of the incidents that other people have picked up on as being the most outrageous, I suppose, is the doctor who told... I completely lost my voice for several months in 2010, end of 2009, beginning of 2010. And the first ENT doctor I saw for that thought that I had vocal cord nodules, and then asked me if I had a boyfriend. I thought, it's a bit of a weird question. I was like, I've been seeing someone. I mean, what's it to you? He went on to explain that nowadays men and women do things that God didn't intend them to do with their orifices. And I was sat there, and there was a female nurse in there as well, and she was sat kind of stone still, and I was sat, as far as I remember, stone still, because, to be honest, apart from what he said, my physical memory of being in that room is quite hazy. I think I dissociated quite quickly from that point. And we just kind of both sat there going, okay? Because neither of us actually knew what to do at all in that scenario. And I just went away and then had to go to a different doctor several months later.
And that, to be fair, that was the bit that I started swearing at the loudest.
Yeah. And oddly enough, it turned out that blowjobs weren't causing my vocal cord nodules. So
you can cross that one off the list then.
Yeah. Amazing.
I mean, just kind of linked to that, do you think it would have helped if you'd seen more female doctors? Because in the book, most of the doctors seem to be male, and I don't know if you think that might have made a difference.
This is a really interesting question. I was thinking about this after you asked that, and in some ways, I think no. Yeah. And the reason I say that is because it's the system which is misogynist and biased in that way. And actually, some of the female doctors I've seen have been worse even than some of the male doctors, because I think to survive, obviously there are good doctors. Otherwise, I wouldn't be sitting here now if there were not doctors who are great and who do listen. But there's a lot of doctors who aren't and who allow bias to inform their decisions without knowing it a lot of the time as well, subconscious bias most of the time. And I think to exist in that system, you have to buy into that system to a degree. And I mean, even more recently after this book, I've developed a chronic skin condition, and a female doctor told me that my partner should have a mastectomy so that I could try a medication that wasn't even licensed for use for that condition.
Okay. That's quite a dramatic, that's a big ask, really. It's a big ask.
It is a big ask. And the next doctor I went to see, oddly enough, didn't even suggest the same medication. So I think in some ways the gender of the doctor matters less than the way that they respond to the system that they operate in.
And how has the journey actually shaped you? Because this has been a lifelong thing. This isn't I've started to feel ill a few years ago. This has been a lifelong thing. So it must have shaped the person that is Polly. You know, in what ways can you recognise that this whole journey has shaped you?
In so many different ways. I mean, there are these obviously very negative ways as well. So I think having that fear that you're not going to be believed about anything that you say, that your own experience of your body is going to be invalidated, because that's what has happened to me over and over again. So then that means every time you try to talk about those things with anybody, your initial fear and assumption is that you're going to be disbelieved. So obviously that particularly affects other medical scenarios as well, that I suppose like a lot of people who do have chronic conditions, I think there's a degree of chronic post-traumatic stress disorder there, which I haven't been diagnosed with, but I know is present in my life. And I don't know what kind of person I would be if I didn't have that in my life. But I think also in other ways it's given me positive things as well, that I think I'm probably more empathetic to other people and more forgiving and understanding of other people, because I know that what you see on the surface is not what's happening. And I think we can say that and we can think we know that, but actually experiencing that for yourself, I think, flips the way that you understand other people as well.
I mean, it's like you say, not all disabilities are visible.
Yeah. I mean, and a huge number of them aren't. And most people who live with a visible disability often also have invisible disability too. So those things aren't mutually exclusive. But having said that as well, I think a lot of things that we call invisible disabilities are not invisible at all. They're just not noticed by most people. So now, I mean, parts of my conditions I think are incredibly visible. Both, and I know with my connective tissue disorder, as soon as I walked in the room when I did get diagnosed eventually, the guy who diagnosed me had known before I sat down. Like, I could see him going, yeah. Like, he did the test because he had to do the test, but he already knew. And I see that in other people. And my other primary condition, which is a metabolic disorder where you absorb too much iron from your diet. One of the main symptoms of that is excessive bronzing of the skin or greying of the skin for a unlucky subset of people. So again, it's visible, but it's considered invisible because people don't know how to read those signs. And that's what I'm really interested in, that not so much invisibility, but not being noticed.
And we'll loop back around to this point again when we talk about the nature cure part, which we will come to, and how your connection with this and nature. But you talked about this being a chronic and a genetic condition. I mean, obviously you've gone through the process of being diagnosed. What impact did that diagnosis have on the family? Was there a ka-ching moment with other family members? Went, that explains a lot.
There was and there wasn't at the same time. It's actually been really interesting that there are certain family members who I think are quite resistant to seeing themselves in that, even though we know both conditions run on both sides of my family, which is really interesting as well, because they wouldn't necessarily do that, but it's very clear that both of them do go down both sides. So it's like, that's why I have an extra double whammy of both. As my parents like to say, I've got the worst genes of all of us. But it's very much changed our understanding of other older family members, particularly family members who are no longer with us as well. So I lost all of my grandparents by the time I was, I think, 16. And other members of that generation of the family as well. And some of those people were quite difficult to be around. Some of them were lovely. Some of them were not the easiest people to be with. But understanding maybe some of the things that they lived with and they experienced that they had no idea about, it has made us able to kind of recalibrate what we thought was going on with them, particularly my dad's dad, who supposedly came back from the Second World War with malaria that would recur. And I remember after he died in the 90s, my dad thinking, I think those were actually breakdowns. But now we look at it and think, he clearly had hemochromatosis. So how does that affect that?
And I just want to kind of one last question there before we start to move into the nature side of things. This is quite a vulnerable book. I was really struck by how much you talked about your medical history, how much you dug into your family's medical history. And I'm not sure many of us would be that comfortable writing about our medical history in that much detail and publishing it in a book for all to read. How traumatic was it for you and your family to dig back through this? Because that must have been quite a challenging... You were asking some difficult questions of your family, as well as going through your own diagnosis. So can you just sort of tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think for me, going back through it, it was definitely going back to those teenage years, and I looked at my diaries from the time I kept a journal when I was a teenager. Most of it's just horrible things about school that I'm not proud of myself for writing. But going back and reliving my despair at that time was definitely re-traumatizing. That was really, really difficult, actually. And remembering how terrified I was on a daily basis, because there were large swathes of time where we thought I was dying as well. And then it turned out I wasn't dying, but there was no help, which is equally terrifying. And then obviously I went back through that again in my 30s, which is like, why are we back here at this point? Oh, still not dying, still feel like I'm dying. But in some ways, I think because I've spent so much of my life trying to explain that to people, it didn't feel particularly revealing or overexposing to write about it. And obviously there are lots of things I haven't written about as well. In some ways it's very selective, actually. But to think about family, I think, is a bit different. And the most nervous I've been, actually, in any process of writing the book. And I was talking to my family all the time while I was writing it, and I include some of their actual words in it. But the most nervous I've been was when I sent it to my mum and dad to get their approval for the legal read. And I don't know why it was so absolutely terrifying. Like, I don't know what I thought they were going to say. I have a really good relationship with my parents. And then my mum rang me up afterwards on video chat and said, "Now, Polly, I've got something to say to you." And I was thinking, oh shit. She's going to say you can't publish the book. What's going to happen? And she said, "You've missed one of my grandparents out." I was like, oh. Well, I mean, that was your list, Mum, to be fair. I've literally just copied down what you told me. And she said, "Oh, you spelled someone else's name wrong. There was an E instead of an O," you know.
So I've got a leading question, actually. And that's just prompted it. If your mum had said no, would you still have published it?
That's a really interesting question. I know some people who have had that scenario with memoirs, and they've gone ahead. I know other people who have had people, because if you include anyone in a book, you have to pass it through a legal read. So if you have a kind of mainstream publisher, that is, they get someone, you have to sign off on all of these things, and they have to go, yeah, I'm okay with what she said about me. So you have to send it to people for approval if you've mentioned real living humans. And I do know people who have been through that process, and the other parties have said, yeah, it's fine. And then after it's published, the relationship is just completely broken down. So you don't know how people are going to respond. And knowing that made me, I think, more nervous about it than I would have been otherwise. I don't think I would have published it if my parents had said no. I would have rewritten it in a different way, because I think as writers, we have a massive responsibility to the people whose stories we tell, who are not ourselves. And we always have to be asking ourselves, am I the right person to be telling this story? Is this my story to tell? And if it's not, leave it the hell alone. Let someone else do it.
Yeah, it was just an impromptu. When you said that, I could just hear my mum's like, "Don't do it."
I know, but it's a kind of scary.
It is. It's that tone of voice, isn't it?
Yeah.
You know the look.
Yeah.
And you're like, "Oh, I'm for it now." So let's just sort of turn this on a bit, because obviously we've talked about all the dark and the difficult. Talk us through some of the positives, and it's starting to link this into the world of, because you live in Grasmere, in a beautiful part of the world, and you love the outdoors. What have been some of the positives on this journey?
Yeah, so I think because my life has been so directed by trying to manage symptoms that I didn't know what the cause of was. I've made lots of choices about what I do, how I live, where I spend my time, where I want to live, how I want to live, which actually have been really positive in lots of ways. So slightly by accident, really. I moved from East London, where I've been living since I left home, up here to the Lake District in 2006 to start a PhD at Lancaster University. And that decision just completely changed my life and has enabled everything that happened since. And I did that, like most things I did, because I couldn't find a job that I could carry on doing every day and survive. I just couldn't do it. So I was always thinking, what can I do? What can I move into which will allow me to not have to be working 9 to 5, which is killing me? So much of my life has been directed by that question, you know, how can I actually survive doing this? And it led me to this completely other world that I'd never imagined myself existing in. I didn't think I wanted to move to the Lake District. I didn't think I wanted to move to a rural area at all. It hadn't really occurred to me. My entire adult life was in London, and all of my friends were in London. And suddenly I found myself kind of transported here. And then having this kind of most amazing, almost like second teenagerhood, actually, at the Wordsworth Trust at that time, where I was doing my PhD with Lancaster University, but with what's now Wordsworth Grasmere. And at that time, it was kind of like a artist campus, full of all these people who would go there from anything upwards from 3 months to volunteer and work there and live in these dilapidated Lake District houses, and have the most extraordinary parties. It was brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
I mean, one of the things that you talked about in the book was how it helps you to notice. You took time and you noticed more detail. And you know, I'm going to go there because I love this story about the deer. And there's a great.
I do too, though.
I love. I mean, it's a great story about where you thought you were just seeing one deer, but you weren't.
Yeah. So there's ways in which I try and think through. So one of the kind of cool messages I think of the book is about diagnosis and what we're doing when we think we're diagnosing something, which can apply to all different areas of our life. So are we asking the right questions? Are we looking carefully in the right ways? And when we're looking carefully, are we understanding what we're seeing? So those are the kind of key questions for my medical life, but I think also for life in general. And I think particularly when we're addressing the natural world and thinking about climate crisis as well, what are we looking at? How are we understanding that? Are we asking the right questions? And while I was thinking about all of this, I had a few experiences where this became very real and practical in the world around me. And one was the daily walk that I take from my house up the hill and round the common land above Grasmere. One winter, I was thinking that I was seeing this same pair of roe deer every day, and I completely thought they were like my best friends. I was like, I love you. Hi, dear. So nice to see you again. Took me like a couple of months to realize that actually it was 3 sets of deer. And as soon as I did realize that, I felt so stupid, because immediately I realized that they looked nothing like each other. And I'd just been assuming, because I never saw them at the same time, on the same walk, I just made the assumption I hadn't looked carefully enough. And as soon as I did look carefully enough, I saw they had completely different characters, obviously different deer, and really different, and completely unmistakable for each other. And that was a really interesting lesson in really paying attention and not expecting what you expect to see.
And I think that ties into what we were saying about not all disabilities are visible,
Yeah.
That actually sometimes maybe we're just not looking closely
Exactly.
enough to see the thing that's there.
Yeah. In some ways, that is what the book is about, really. It's about learning to really look closely and see what's actually there instead of what you think is there. And that's a process that we're all always continually going through, and it's a continual learning process, which is a very Wordsworthian idea as well, this idea of having a kind of a keener eye and an ear that's really listening to what's around you, which might be, in Wordsworthian terms, the ghostly language of the ancient earth, or it might be, a flower in the wind.
But that's it. It slows you down, and made
Yeah.
you pay that attention. Now, excuse me. One of the things that we share is an enjoyment for going swimming, and one of the things I'd underlined in Polly's book is, not a plot spoiler, but you like swimming because you can't fall over in water. And I'd said that to my husband many times, because you can't fall over in water. Do you want to read us a little bit about the swimming, and then just talk a bit about how important it is and how it actually helps you?
Yes. So I had this marked and now I've lost it. Oh, there we go. So the phrase "you can't fall over in water," as quoted in the book, actually was in a tweet that Kate Davis, the Cumbrian poet, wrote, who is another disabled swimmer as well. So this is some of my swimming. I'm going to transport us to a different season here. It's an early evening in early May. I go for a swim in the lake, and it is glorious. I go in feeling sad and defeated, and the water does what it does. It holds me up. It shows me myself with a filter of sunlight and the odd clarity of lake light. It reflects me back at myself, shows me flying above the fells and through the blue sky, how the sky is also in the water. It reminds me the body breathes in the in-between, in the neither one nor the otherness of the warmer water just below the membrane of the lake's surface. That the body breaches this surface, links water and air, that the body is only one creature amongst many, that the body is permeable. The leaky cup of the body overflows and is refilled by the leaky cup of the lake. That permeability is life. What it doesn't do is heal me. What it doesn't do is make me better. Swimming does what it always does. It moves my muscles and joints gently and without the drag of gravity making my blood pool in my hands and legs. It allows me to move more easily, less painfully. It lets me feel joy in movement. What it doesn't do is erase the pain, not during the swim, certainly not after.
And and that's how important swimming is to you. And you describe that one particular swim where it was so still and clear. You sort of take us just through that a little bit, and how that, what was the impact of that on you?
So at the beginning,
you sort of, it's so still and it's so clear, and there was a reflection of the mountains.
Yeah. So one of the things I particularly love, here we go, about swimming in lakes in particular, is my favorite swimming weather is when the lake is just completely flat. To, again, use a Wordsworthian phrase, a perfect mirror, as Dorothy Wordsworth infamously said. Although it's very rarely perfect, Dorothy, what were you saying? But then you get this amazing experience, because I swim breaststroke mostly, because part of the experience of swimming is aesthetic for me. And I love to look around me and to hear and see as I go. So this is a little bit of that. The lake is in my favourite mood today. The surface still as a scrying glass, reflecting the fells, the trees, the sky, the sun gleaming on and through it. I swim breaststroke mostly, and when I push my arms out, palms together, through the water, I feel I am swimming through the sky, swimming through the fells. I am splitting forests apart with my arms. I am opening mountains and folding the sky into them. As I turn my palms and bring them back, my arms back to my sides, I am opening mountains and folding them into my body. It is the closest to flying I can get.
It's just so beautiful. I mean, if you know the fells, because you're in Grasmere, aren't you?
Yeah.
And you've got Loughrig Terrace reflecting down into it, and it's beautiful. And you're talking about this sort of being in nature and swimming, but then also the nature cure, and as you called it, the impossible pill. I just think it's maybe a good time to maybe link into that and see, if you obviously read us apart from the book, but also tell us really, what is it that you mean by that?
Yeah, so part of the reason why I wrote this book in the way that I wrote it, and that there is so much of the natural world in it, is because in those years, particularly the years when I was illest before my diagnosis, there has been this amazing resurgence of nature writing in the UK. Absolutely fantastic work. But all the writing that I was seeing, particularly about swimming and particularly about the Lake District, was falling into this paradigm of the nature cure. So this idea that you can go spend time with trees, lick a frog, go for a swim, and you'll be cured from whatever ailment you have. And I was really confused by this because I was like, well, I spend loads of time with trees. I hug a tree quite often, always have bare feet outside, go for a swim all the time, still chronically ill, getting iller and iller and iller. So what gives? So something is wrong about this. And I couldn't find any writing at that time that reflected that at all, particularly in the UK. There was just nothing that wasn't falling into this kind of trap of nature being literally curative. And I started to think particularly about cure and what cure means. And one of the other writers that I turned to in this book is the American writer Eli Clare, who writes very beautifully about cure and the kind of implications of cure as a restoration to something that never was for most of us. And what it means to try and want to kind of turn back away from the present. And I started to think, well, what can our relationship with nature be if it's not a relationship of cure? And that isn't saying that nature can't be therapeutic to us, or we can't find solace or joy or beauty or comfort in it. I think all of those things are really valid. But when we think of nature as something that is going to cure us, we're creating a transactional relationship with it, where we go to nature expecting it to do something for us as humans. And I just think that's really wrong and really dangerous as well, especially in this time of ever-increasing climate crisis. To think that nature is there for us, when it's just there doing what it does, and most of the time we're actually destroying it. I think we need to really shift that and break that apart in a dramatic and urgent way.
I think and I thought it was really interesting. It really struck me, this whole idea that, if you've got a chronic genetic condition, nature can't cure it.
Yeah, and also that is nature. I mean, illness is also nature. Yeah. Viruses are nature, bacteria are nature. Bad things are nature as well as good things. And that's, I think, part of what we erase when we have this kind of, forest bathing aesthetic, where we think, oh yeah, it's always going to be great. And it doesn't work for everybody either. And I think there's also, for me, there is a real element of victim blaming in that as well, that it kind of ties into that whole kind of mode of thinking that you're ill because you're not living in the right way, you're not doing the right things, you're eating too much, you're not eating enough. You're exercising too much, you're not exercising enough. You're not spending enough time with plants, you're spending too much time with the wrong plants. There's nothing you can do that's right in this sense. And when you know that you have an incurable condition, what does that do to that kind of messy idea? Basically, it's a lot messier than we want it to be.
Yeah, it's actually just interesting hearing you say that bit, just thinking then about the guilt you then must start to feel about, this is my fault, I'm doing something wrong, I feel guilty, I'm ill, and I feel guilty because I feel like it's me making myself ill.
And most people with chronic conditions go through that, and some people never move out of that phase either. I think it took me actually a lot of anger and rage and resistance to move out of that phase myself. But I think most people are siphoned into that phase because that's what we're told by everybody. So, you're told if you adjust your behaviour, you can make yourself better. And for most people, actually, it's really not that simple.
And just actually, we've talked a lot about the Lake District and nature, but actually, you talk a lot about Nottingham and the caves. And actually, I thought it might be quite fun to just sort of come back to that a little bit, because obviously, I know we're in the Lake District and it rocks, but it was a great discovery to learn about the caves in Nottingham and the way that you weave it together with your diagnosis and the labyrinth of exploration there. Can you just tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so when I started to think about particularly the nature of genetic illness, for some reason I started to think about caves, and I didn't really know why it was happening at first. I kept having this kind of weird image pop up of this school trip I went on to a place called Cresswell Crags, which has an amazing visitor centre, so I definitely recommend going there nowadays. But I had quite a terrifying experience there on a school trip when I was little, where I genuinely thought that I was going to slip into a cave and die because I was at the back of a long line of children. I'm not sure how endangered I really was, since no one else seems to remember this apart from me. But I was utterly convinced that I was just going to slide off this pathway and fall through time and never be found again. And that I would become one of these bones. So Cresswell Crags is a kind of gorge on the Nottinghamshire-Derbyshire border. And it has this system of caves there that have been inhabited since prehistoric times. But also a really fascinating history of excavation as well, because they were discovered because a local villager, I think it was actually his wife, who had a dream that there was treasure in the caves. So they went to start to dig them up, and what they found was dinosaur bones. And then it became this amazing site of prehistoric discoveries in the Victorian era. But they're still discovering all this, like this discovery is kind of continuous, it's ongoing. And I didn't know why I kept coming back to this image of Cresswell Crags and what it meant. And then I realised that growing up in Nottingham, the entire city is built on a network of caves, and they're just running underneath everything. So our school locker rooms had kind of grated off bits of caves that I had to run past in order to get to my locker, because I was terrified of whatever was going to come out of that, like that dark space behind the grate. And you could go and sleep in haunted caves under pubs and all that kind of stuff. And it made that kind of history and those layers of history very co-present in our lives. And thinking about the ancientness of these genetic mutations, particularly hemochromatosis, has been it's a genetic mutation that's been in the British Isles since the Bronze Age. And when you think about that, you can't help but think about that kind of sedimented time.
Absolutely, and that's what I love about the book, because I'm a bit of a geology and history nerd, and it was like I wasn't just reading about you and learning about this. I was learning about. I didn't know there were caves under Nottingham. Just before we move to audience questions, I'm going to ask an impertinent question, because they're my favourite. Do you ever wish you don't have it, or does it make you who you are?
If I didn't have it, I wouldn't be me. So I wish I had less pain and less complicated other symptoms, for sure. And I wish there's lots of damage that I think has been done by the slowness of diagnosis that could have been avoided completely. Like really simple things as well. Like I wouldn't have paresthesia in my fingertips if I had B12 injections when they first realised my B12 was low when I was 16, instead of waiting until I was 36 to start giving them to me. I might actually still be able to feel my fingertips. That would be quite nice, wouldn't it? But if I took away the conditions full stop, I'd be a different version of myself. So it's a kind of clone club scenario, really, that there would be a Polly, but she wouldn't be me. So I would quite like to exist. So I'd like to be me, but maybe a souped-up version.
A souped-up version, super Polly.
Yeah.
I think we could get T-shirts made. I really think we could get T-shirts made. So thank you for that. I'm conscious of time, and we want to pass the opportunity to ask some questions out to the audience. We don't have a roving microphone, so if you could either speak loudly, and I'll repeat it back if you're a bit on the quiet side. Does that sound fair? So if anyone's got any questions. Oh, come on, you can do better than that. Lovely lady at the back in the very nice yellow hat.
I really hope it will. So, like, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome is considered rare, but it's actually common, but it's quite hard to diagnose because it's diagnosed by clinician kind of looking at you, basically. So it relies on expert clinicians. Hemochromatosis is super easy to diagnose because there's very simple blood tests and then a very simple recognizable gene test. It's unmistakable. It's also the most common genetic mutation in the UK. So I think, I can't remember numbers, it's in the book, but I think that 20 million people in the UK probably actually have it, and something like 20,000 are diagnosed. That's how poor the diagnosis rate is. Recently, probably the reason you've seen those ads is because there was a paper in the Lancet calling for screening, but only for young men. Now, it can affect anybody. Oh, and young white men as well. Young white men are allowed to be screened for it, but everyone else just, go build up your iron toxicity, who cares? And it's relying on such ancient, antiquated ideas about the condition. It's actually staggering that that's what they've put forward. So the Hemochromatosis Society, who are a charity, have been fighting really hard to counteract that. So they have had a publicity campaign, and I'm glad that that's actually coming through. But it's a very unknown condition, and even amongst medical professionals, it's really unknown. And my consultant I see, although I haven't seen him in so long that the nurse practitioner and I were just discussing whether he's actually still practicing. My consultant is actually a hepatologist. He's a liver expert, and most of the time hemochromatotics get seen under hepatology or gastroenterology because there is no specialism in it, and it is the most common genetic condition in the UK, and there's no specialism, there's no screening, there's no testing. So I hope that talking about it and raising awareness can do something and can start to shift that. I've certainly noticed myself that as soon as I was diagnosed, I started talking to other people about it. The number of other people who it turned out did have it was remarkable. So even in the book, I go to Rathlin Island because I want to find out more about a Bronze Age chieftain who had the genes for it, who was buried there, and met two people who were there for the birds, which is what Rathlin Island is famous for, and was talking to them at breakfast, and one of them had hemochromatosis. Wow. And he was like, I had no idea that this island was connected with the history of hemochromatosis. But so I think it's one of those things also, you notice more when you talk about it, but then I hope that snowballs.
Fantastic. Thank you. Any other questions from the audience? Yes, gentleman there.
Are you able to get much therapeutic benefit through walking, or too risky?
It's such a shame. I love walking, and my upper body loves to walk. My lower body hates to walk. So I have a lot of problems with my knees and with my ankles. I broke one of my toes on a stool, which is the most annoying thing in the universe, in 2017. And after that, I developed a neuroma in my foot, which is a kind of a nerve bundle that lots of runners have, which I think is one of the most ironic things that my body could have possibly produced. And it becomes incredibly painful if I walk for more than a mile or two. So I walk regularly, but slowly, and I take a lot of breaks. And I love to walk, and I love to slow walk especially, but it's very frustrating to me that I can't walk for more than a couple of miles, or then I can't walk at all for a week or two, which is, a bit rubbish. I've experimented with using like an all-terrain, can't think of the right word, like a tramper, that's the word. And that's good in some ways, but then I get really cold as well. And this is the problem with having like conditions that have conflicting access needs, trying to work out how to be outside in the best ways. So I miss walking more, but I love the contact with place that you get through walking.
Yeah, I know in the book you talk about some of the times that you were confident on a walk, you knew, but
Yeah.
being brave enough then to go a little bit further onto a bit that you
Yeah,
weren't
yeah.
so familiar with.
So I also am quite because I have balance issues as well as a strong capacity to fall over. So I'm always thinking about how safe is a path and how well do I know that path as well. So I have to think about that quite a lot. So there's a walk that I do a lot from home, which is it's like 1.2 miles, but I can spend a good hour or two doing it and hanging out with a deer, visiting the owl, saying hi to the heron, that kind of thing as I go along. And it's not exactly exercise, but it's, good
But
in
it
lots
is
of other
exercise.
ways. Yeah,
It is
yeah.
exercise.
It's movement.
It's movement. And kind of tied into the walking as well.
Yeah.
As we'd said, and I know we shared this before, is that when you're in the water, you can't fall, but actually getting into the water is the danger zone, isn't it? And like if anybody's been lake swimming, we're familiar with that part.
Yeah, so again, I have like my set places where I get into the lake, and I went for a swim yesterday, and I was a bit annoyed because there were like people fishing on either side, so I had to go, like there was only one place I could go in that I knew that was safe for me, where I wasn't going to bump my feet on anything when my feet were cold and I came out, because again, breaking toes, not that much fun. But yeah.
Yeah, it's a danger zone.
Kate Fox has this amazing thing. Instead of wild swimming, she talks about mild swimming, and I really appreciate that like I love to swim outdoors, but I don't do it for risk. Like I'm no risk, thank you. I do not want to court any more risk than I have just being alive in my body.
Yeah.
So yeah.
That sounds about right. There was a lady at the back that raised her hand with a question, and I'll.
Hi. Mm.
Something that never was, pure restoration, something that never was. I was just thinking how useful that is in kind of dietary and ecological terms as well. And I wondered if you had any thoughts on what chronic illness could offer to this time of kind of multiple planetary crises, and particularly if there's any kind of language or ways of relating with chronic illness that you think could be useful on a kind of ecological approach.
That's such a good question. So thinking about kind of connecting restoration and chronic illness and climate change and how we think about those things. So one of the things I talk about in the book, I did a project a few years ago with my poet hat on, where I worked with a climate biologist for Magma, a poetry magazine, who worked with the RSPB but on habitat restoration. And she said some really fascinating things that really stuck with me about the fact that you can never restore a landscape. You can only create something else. So it's different, not better, not worse, but different is what she said. So you can create a different habitat out of what was there. And I think that's really useful for thinking about chronic illness. And I think one of the other sets of language, apart from kind of nature cure discourse, that I find quite troubling when we think about climate crisis and the environment in general, is kind of the language of brokenness and sickness about the earth and about the world. Because again, it ties into this kind of natural, unnatural binary that I think is really unhelpful. And I think when we start to think about the world as sick or as broken, then we're thinking in quite an ableist way about it as well, because we're also saying we're kind of discounting it on that basis, saying, oh, it's so terrible that this world is so broken. It's so awful. What are we going to do about it? And I think if you shift into thinking of life on the planet as a chronic condition, maybe, we can think about that in more hopeful and inclusive ways, where we can allow for difference and for multiple various ways of being, which aren't necessarily falling into this healthy, unhealthy paradigm in the same way. So there's definitely a lot more, I think, to discover in that.
Fantastic. Did you have a question?
Yeah, just a quick one. It's kind of a big question, but I guess linked to the first one, you mentioned about that there's kind of a lot of things that are like disregarded in the gender community, and there are some other things about like the gender health gap and things like that. So I just wondered if there's anything like maybe individuals could be doing, or that the education system that new doctors could be doing to make sure that that doesn't get bigger or get worse.
Yeah, I think we need a massive shift in the entire way we think about medicine and diagnosis, and also patients and the role of patients. I mean, just this week, I actually think about things that make you swear. I'm sure some people in this room have seen this, that CBT has just been licensed as the best new treatment for the menopause. So chronic behavioural therapy, which is meant to make you change your ways of thinking. So you're now meant to be able to manage hot flushes by learning to think differently about them, which, let me tell you, is not going to work. And these changes are happening all the time. And like one of the things that happened during the writing of this book is that new guidance came out as well in the UK, new NICE guidance, saying that primary pain patients, so patients who have pain of unknown cause, can no longer be treated with painkillers, but should be treated with antidepressants instead. And it just genuinely mind-boggling. So in some ways things are getting worse, not better, as so many things are. And those are kind of exponentially increasing the more pressure there is from different directions, because obviously if we push all of the pressure onto patients to think differently about themselves rather than actually thinking about treating a condition or finding out what's really wrong with them, then we kind of think we're saving health resources. Although obviously in the long term we're not, because you just end up with a load of sicker people. So I just think we need to dismantle a lot and rebuild it. On the plus side, I've had a lot of great responses from doctors who've read this book and want to change how they're doing things, have reflected on how they're doing things as well, and want to make some of those things better. So I think the will is there on that level. It's just on the systemic level, can we make that change? And I think it needs cooperation from a lot of people to do that.
Fantastic. I'm quite conscious of time, so I just want to ask one more question. I'm sure Polly will be able to answer any other questions you've got after the event. But I want to ask, the theme of the Mountain Fest is joy. And I know we've touched on it a little bit, but one final question. What brings you joy outdoors?
So all sorts of things bring me joy. And I think, oh gosh, there's so much to say about joy. I've been thinking about joy a lot, and joy is resistance, particularly, and who's allowed joy, who isn't allowed joy, who's expected to have joy, who's shut out of joy. It's something I've been thinking about a lot in my poetry, particularly over the last few years, as a response to the deep despair that I have felt as in kind of abandonment by both the government and society in general during the pandemic. And joy feels like a massive reclamation of personhood and of humanity in that. And there's some amazing disabled writers who write about this. So there's a great piece by Kia Brown in Disability Visibility, where she writes about, particularly about joy as a black disabled woman as well, and kind of reclaiming that space, and joy as resistance. And there's other writers. There's an amazing artist and writer, Letty McHugh, who writes about storing up small joys, the way a bear might hoard things for winter. And I definitely think of joy like that as something that comes in flashes, which you can get from anything, from tiny, tiny, tiny things. you know, we were talking about this earlier, like I'm like a 5-year-old, so very small things please me. So a bird at the feed, or a quality of light, or, you know, a shiny badge, or a conker, as we were talking about. You know, I find joy in literally the kind of smallest things. But then finding a way to store that. And something I've been thinking about a lot this year is that it's not just enough to gather those things or to gather light. I need to learn how to create some as well. So that's my next project, is to learn how to be a joy source.
A joy generator.
Yeah,
That's
a joy
it,
generator.
A joy generator. Right, well, the numbers have gone red and the trapdoors are about to
Yeah.
open. So can I just say a few thank yous. Thank you to you, the audience, for coming along. We really do appreciate it. And thank you for supporting the festival and coming along to support us. Thank you to the volunteers and to Toby, who looks after the town hall. Thank you to Cotswold Outdoors. And of course, please join me in thanking Polly, who'll be doing book signings after.
Thank you, Beth.